Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Weaver and fiber artist Edith Penn Meyer knew her friend Sandy Merritt's relationship with a married man was wrong. She had even urged Sandy to take out a restraining order against Kenneth Carpenter, which was why her call to Sandy on February 23, 2005, seemed to come from right out of the blue. During it, she told Sandy to drop the restraining order and get back together with Ken. Penn was never seen again. One man stood to gain from Penn's disappearance, Ken Carpenter. But evidence was bleak. No blood, no DNA, no body. Until detectives found notes hidden beneath a leather chair that turned out to be a playbook for murder. The book we're featuring this evening is Notes on a Killing, with my guest, journalist and author, Kevin Flynn. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Kevin Flynn.
Dan, thank you so much. The pleasure is mine.
Well, thank you very much. This is a really great story, and you've have written it with a lot of flair. So let's get right to it. A question I ask often because it's very revealing, without giving too much of the story away at all, which you probably won't, but tell us why this was a story that you felt compelled to do. How did you come to write this story, Notes on a Killing?
A couple of things really come to mind, Dan, why I and my co-author, Rebecca Lavoie, selected this story. One was that at the time of the case, I was a television reporter here in New Hampshire, and I got assigned the story one day while it was still considered a missing persons case. And there's an extended passage in the middle of the book kind of detailing that one day that I spent on the case. It stumbled across some evidence, and we were able to do a little shoe leather journalism and figure out this mysterious address in the deep woods where nefarious things were going on. And anyway, it was always for that reason a favorite story of mine. But the thing that got Rebecca interested in the story was the tale of the victim in this case, Penn Meyer. Penn was an extraordinary woman by all accounts. Really revered, almost put on a pedestal by the folks in the area. She was a woman who came from great wealth, but did not necessarily live off of her family's largesse. She lived very modestly in a house on a little lake in rural New Hampshire. She lived in the town of Goshen, and the lake was nicknamed the Goshen Ocean by the residents. Penn liked to, as you say, sort of made her money by weaving fabrics and afghans and being a fiber artist, where she would sell her wares at local farmers markets. She was always with her favorite dog, Fluff. She and Fluff went everywhere together. And that included the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings that she attended. Although she was, a free spirit and beloved by her friends, she also had her demons that she was working on. She was in recovery, and she was the kind of person who liked to help out her friends. And she really extended herself. And as we find out in the book, that is her undoing. Her kindness, her interest in her friends, her willingness to stand up for somebody in need is how she ended up in the situation she was in.
And she's, like you mentioned, an independent person, but sort of, to paint a picture, she's a former, you describe her as a very stunning woman, very, very pretty, athletic, very, very, very pretty woman. And now that she's a little bit older, she still had that athleticism and had the look. She was still a very noticeable woman.
Yeah, she was, in her mid-50s, but she was still very trim, very toned. Her skin was always very kind of brown from the sun because she would go out. She had a pretty strict routine, which was she would get up in the morning and go for a walk with her dog Fluff, and in the wintertime, in the afternoon, she'd go snowshoeing. So she was always outside. She had a green thumb and loved to work in the garden and other people's gardens and local farms in her bare feet and really get dirty. She had her own sort of interesting sense of style. She had these big bangles and bracelets that were very distinctive to her. So she still had flair, and she had a lot of personality. And to some extent, you might say she was stubborn in the sense that she wasn't one who suffered fools lightly.
I see. Now, this community, too, we're talking, is this Newport, New Hampshire, we talking about?
Well, it's the closest city on any map would be Newport, and we'd like to say that the town that Penn was living in, Goshen, you couldn't find on a map that didn't have a considerable amount of detail. It's very easy to miss it. We have a saying here in New England that when someone's asking for directions, you say, "Oh, well, you can't get there from here," and that's kind of true because on the map it's you want to get from this town to that town, but what you don't know is there's a mountain in the way and this lake, and the road goes 20 miles in the opposite direction. So the county in which all this action takes place, Sullivan County, is pretty small and rural. There is some working farms, but it's mostly just sort of woods, people living in very modest homes, sort of living a country kind of lifestyle in New England. And so Penn, just kind of she comes from a family of industrialists. She had lots of money. Her relatives, her ancestors came over on the Mayflower, but she didn't live that flashy lifestyle. She certainly, I guess you could say she went native. She fit right in with the folks in New Hampshire and wore, very modest clothes and drove a Honda CRV and didn't drive a Cadillac. And although she really could have, flaunted her wealth, she just kind of fit in.
Now, had she been married and for the purpose of this story at this time in the story, she had a boyfriend. So tell us a little bit about what her marital status was over the years and where she was currently.
Yeah, she had been married twice before. She had been married when she was younger, had 3 kids with her first husband, and she remained good friends with her first husband. He was a vice president of a bank nearby. They had an amicable relationship. She had 3 grown kids, a son and 2 daughters, and she had gotten remarried around, I think it's around 2001 or 2002. And our story takes place in late 2005. And her marriage, her second marriage was on the rocks. Her husband was drinking too much, and of course she was in recovery, and so she wanted to get some support for that, for being the spouse of a problem drinker. And so she went to Al-Anon, which is a very similar program to AA. It really is for family members of folks who have an addiction, and how are you supposed to deal with that person? And it is here that she met another fellow whose name was Jonathan Purick. Jonathan was about the same age, his mid-50s. He had been married 4 times himself. and it took him, the better part of his life to realize that all of his relationships had fallen apart and all of his career aspirations had fallen apart because of his drinking. And he finally got sober and, took to the program pretty well. And it's at this Al-Anon meeting that the two of them first meet. He is very taken by Penn, of course, because she's very charismatic. When she walks into a room, she doesn't seem like everybody else. She's got this bright personality, this aura around her. So he's immediately attracted, and while they are, very close friends, while Penn's marriage is falling apart, they have a platonic relationship. And it isn't until after Penn tells Jonathan that she is going to get a divorce that Jonathan asks her out, and she says that she would like that, but she's going to wait till the divorce is final. And Jonathan was a little put off, but then he realizes this is just another part of her character, that even though she's not, going to stay in the marriage, she's true to her vows, and right. That said a lot to him. So once the divorce was final, she and Jonathan were a couple, and their relationship was very intense. They felt very passionately about each other.
Now, with her second marriage, I believe, to Richard Rankin, or at some point she met a woman named Joanne Dufour, and Penn had helped Joanne, encouraged her basically to get a much better job than when she had met her, and a job with benefits, and that encouraged the woman, and she got that. Just wanted to introduce that. Did she meet Joanne during that second marriage, or?
Yeah, I think it was around that second marriage. They met through AA, and one of the ways that she would help Joanne out is Joanne didn't have a car. I'm not quite certain whether or not she lost the car, or as happens a bit, she lost her license. But Penn would, give her rides everywhere. And, whether Joanne was expecting it or not, Penn would, if she caught her walking on the road, she'd just pull up beside her and tell her to get in the car and take her wherever she wanted. And it's on a February day in 2006 where Joanne is waiting for Penn to come pick her up in the morning because she has a dentist appointment. And Penn does not arrive. And Joanne immediately knows that there's something wrong because if Penn were stuck somewhere, Penn would have called. If Penn were sick, she would have called. If Penn had gotten into an accident and was stuck in a ditch, she would have gone to somebody's house to call and say that she couldn't make it. So Penn not showing up for Joanne to take her to that appointment was the first red flag that something was wrong.
Now let's go back. I apologize for introducing her sort of a little bit out of order here. So let's get to another main character. Joanne is definitely a main character in this as well, but one of the more major characters is Sandy Merritt. So let's introduce Sandy Merritt. Who is she, and how did her and Penn meet and become friends?
Well, again, Penn met Sandy through AA. Sandy was what was referred to as a newbie. She had been in the program for less than a year. Sandy had her own demons to deal with. She had a dual diagnosis, which means not only did she have an addiction, but she had mental health issues. So she'd always struggled with her sobriety. But she had gotten into AA in the area and had been had been sticking with the program and doing well and socializing with different people in the program. And Sandy was, I should say, Penn was just friendly with Sandy and kept an eye out for her, and happened to notice that Sandy was getting herself into a pretty bad spot as far as her relationships go. And so Penn was keeping an eye on her about that.
Well, what was it about the relationship that Sandy had confided in Penn about, and what was exactly wrong with that relationship in Penn's mind?
Well, the relationship that Sandy had begun was with another guy in AA by the name of Ken Carpenter. Now, everybody knew Ken in the AA meetings, as of course they all do in this small community and the smaller, more intimate community of AA. But Ken was known very much as someone who could talk a good meeting. He really knew the platitudes of AA, could talk the 12 steps out. Very charismatic in that setting. But Ken was married, and he was married to, of course, and it seems another woman from AA, a nurse by the name of Cynthia Harvey, and everybody called her Harv for short. So Sandy was having an affair with Ken. Ken had told Sandy that his relationship with Harv was loveless. It was on its last legs. That they, were about to get a divorce. But this wasn't the case. Harv had no idea that Ken was saying this or feeling this. It was just some subterfuge so that Ken could have a relationship with Sandy. Sandy confided some of, the complications of her relationship with Ken, which of course Ken wanted to keep a secret. Sandy confided these with Penn. Penn's first concern was, she wasn't going to be judgy about whether or not, Sandy should carry on with a married man. But she was very concerned that Ken, who had 20-plus years of sobriety, was dating a newbie, because that is one of the verboten things about the 12-step program, is that if you're new to the program and you're dealing with your addiction, a new relationship, a sexual relationship, is not advisable, because you really need, they believe, that first year to sort of find yourself. And in fact, it's called the 13th step, that people should not, AA members should not date other AA members during their first year of recovery. So, Penn and Jonathan, who had been sober for a long time, been in the program, that we consider that a different situation. But Ken should have known better than to be flirting and, for lack of a better term, preying on Sandy. So, Penn was under the same impression that Sandy was, that Ken and Harv had a very a thin relationship, that they were on the outs, and that a divorce of some kind, a separation of some kind, was imminent as soon as Ken could figure out, the financials of it and how he could keep her insurance and other things that could kind of stretch the relationship out for about 10 months. So Penn knew all of this, and it wasn't until Penn and Jonathan went to a party one evening that Ken was at with his wife Harv. And when Penn arrived and saw Ken and Harv together as husband and wife, she realized that the story that Ken had been feeding Sandy all these months was a lie. They were most definitely together, or at the very least, Harv had no idea that she was supposed to not be with Ken. And Ken, realizing that he'd been caught, cornered Penn at the party, begged her not to say anything to Sandy, and Penn.
And what did she say? In response to that?
Well, she said she basically
wasn't going to lie
Ken,
for him.
No, she wasn't going to lie for him, and she, it was, we all kind of found surprising that, he's caught in this adulterous relationship, and his thing isn't to say, "Don't tell my wife." His thing is to say, "Don't tell my girlfriend." And they have been through the program together. They had these life skills, and the first thing that Penn says is, you have to remember, the fifth step, and the seventh step, and the steps that say you have to, be true and make amends to people, and Ken's response was another AA platitude, which was, you have to sweep your own side of the street. Which in the program means you can't worry about what other people are doing. You have to focus on yourself. But the way he's saying it is mind your own business. So about a week later, Sandy learns the truth that she had been taken advantage of, and she breaks the relationship off with Ken. But it doesn't end there.
Now, I wanted to ask this question because this is one thing. You were very subtle in this regard, not very judgmental or anything. But it wasn't really clear whether Ken is a real playboy at these meetings because, again, he's been involved for a long time. He knows better. And Sandra is certainly not, in terms of she's more vulnerable, she's depressed, she's got more problems. And she's certainly not competition for Penn or anything in terms of looks or his own wife in terms of looks. So is he sort of a playboy? Is he picking on vulnerable women?
Yeah, a couple of things going on there with Ken. I mean, he wasn't necessarily, the most handsome guy, but you have to remember that they are in a group of people that have, hit rock bottom in that term, and are rebuilding their lives, and they're very, very vulnerable, and the experiences are something that are known to just that handful of people. They know what it's like to go through that. So that kind of knowledge and experience is, and mixed in with his charm, is a very powerful thing so that both men and women looked up to Ken. And Ken has the brain of an addict. He was an alcoholic. He had done drugs. He was sober when it came to those kinds of substances, but he was still an addict, and he was still acting out. And in the way that he was acting out was sexually, and he had a predator's mind, and so that he could look around the room, and some people might call it bird dogging, but he was sizing up all the women in the room and trying to figure out who might I be able to hit on, who might I be able to score with, and Sandy, who was extremely vulnerable to begin with. New to the program, had her own set of baggage, was somebody that was easy prey for him. And so that's one of the reasons why, he was able to take such, thorough control of Sandy. Sandy thought they were having a real relationship for many, many months. And to some way, I think Ken believed it too, but it isn't until the relationship fell apart that Ken couldn't accept the fact that Sandy didn't want to be with him, couldn't accept the fact that for all of his powers of charm, for all of his ability to control people, he couldn't control Sandy. And Dan, I know you've seen these situations where there's a guy who says, "Look, if you don't want me, no one else can have you," and take all their rage out on the former lover. Well, in this case, because of the way his mind works, Ken didn't see the problem as Sandy. He saw the problem as Penn. Penn was the interloper. Penn was the one who helped Sandy get out of the relationship. Penn is the person that is keeping them apart. And if he could somehow convince Penn to change her mind or to get Penn out of the way, then he could resume his relationship with Sandy. That's how he thought.
No, but why did he believe? Did Sandy confide in him to say that this was her best friend and she always spoke to Penn, and Penn was the kind of person that talked her into this and talked her into that? How was he so confident that it was her friend Penn and not someone else that was close to her?
Well, one of the things was, in the weeks after the breakup, there is almost textbook stalking behavior where he's calling Sandy and he's leaving flowers at Sandy's house and showing up at work and approaching her at AA meetings and bothering her. It comes to the point where Sandy says that she needs to get a restraining order, and so in order to do that, she had to basically take Ken to court. And she needed people to testify on her behalf about, some of the behavior. And the first person to testify was Penn. Penn came to Sandy's defense in the civil courtroom and basically explained the kind of behavior that Ken had displayed. There was this odd little anecdote that happened around Thanksgiving, which was about the time of the breakup. Apparently, Sandy and Ken originally had plans to go to Penn's house for Thanksgiving. And then after the breakup, of course, Sandy went, and there was an extra place at the table. So she brought a friend of hers, who they were school friends, but he was, he had just joined the program, and so he was a newbie too. And it wasn't a romantic thing, but Jonathan and Penn's family, they all had Thanksgiving together. And when Ken Carpenter found out that that Sandy still went to Penn's house and that his seat at the table was taken by another man, a rival in his mind, he became angry with Penn, and blamed Penn for trying to set up Sandy with with another guy. I mean, everybody sort of in AA that at the end that knew that Ken and Sandy had this relationship was trying to tell Ken that, you got to back off. And, there are all sorts of reasons why you shouldn't have had this relationship in the first place. One, you're married. Two, she's a newbie. So, it wasn't a secret that Penn was an advocate for Sandy, and so that made her a target.
Yeah. Now let's talk about where Sandra or Sandy works, and she's a big pet lover, and so is Penn. Penn has a little dog named Fluff, and they're inseparable. And Sandra, I guess, is part of their friendship as well. But Sandra is involved with taking care of animals as a occupation. So tell us a little bit more about her occupation, and because pets are important in this story to a great degree, I think.
Yeah, Sandy, is a dog person. One of her jobs was, to be a dog walker. So you can imagine her with, a fistful of leashes and, 10 unruly dogs of different sizes. And at the time of our story, she's working at a kennel called the Animal Inn. And when she gets there every morning, first thing she has to do is she's got to feed the dogs. And so if you can imagine how that scene can play out, how loud it is inside the kennel where you have a dozen or so dogs who are hungry, and the first person shows up in the morning who are going to feed them. So that's a very chaotic time to be a worker there, and this is about 7:30 in the morning, and on this one particular morning, as Sandy's trying to feed the dogs, the telephone rings, and she picks up the phone, and it's Penn. Sandy was a little confused why Penn would be calling. Penn knows not to call that early because she's feeding the dogs, and it's very loud. And obviously, on the other end of the phone, she can hear the dogs barking. So Sandy's having a hard time concentrating. But what Penn tells Sandy when she picks up the phone is that she says, I was wrong. I was wrong about Ken. You need to go to the court and get the restraining order lifted, and you have to get back together with him. And, of course, now Sandy's, very confused because, obviously, Penn had been her biggest advocate. She went to court, got the restraining order. When Ken eventually broke the restraining order and started and was going to be facing criminal charges, Penn was still there for Sandy as an advocate. So now for Penn to tell Sandy that she's wrong and that she was mistaken and that she really should get back together with Ken was very confusing. Penn went on to say that what would be best for her, what best for Sandy to do would be to get back together with Ken and then move into Penn's house and to stay there and take care of the dog and start a life together with Ken there. And last thing she said was that she was going to be going out of town and she might not be back for a while. Sandy, of course, doesn't know what to make of this phone call. It's very chaotic with the dogs barking. She says, can I call you back at lunchtime? And she hangs up the phone. and Penn is never heard from again after that phone call.
Yeah, the thing is, though, she doesn't. You don't really put in the book whether she noticed the tone to be insincere, but certainly the language and the content are totally out of character, given her encouragement for the exact opposite of what she was now saying on the phone. She also included, "I pushed you. I was jealous of you. He really loves you as his only crime. I will send you a letter outlining all the ways I've manipulated you in this regard." And so it was very, very odd in terms of the content. You outlined most of the other stuff. That this does not sound like the kind of language that Penn would use at all, period. And then, going to tell recommending to her friend go back to the judge and tell her it was all a mistake. And so from that, she decides to call her back because there's this bombshell. Tell us what happens next, about later in the day when Sandra tries to contact her friend Penn.
Of course, Sandy is leaving messages at Penn's house, and Penn is not responding. As you recall, Joanne Duford, who is waiting to get a ride to the dentist. Penn does the show. Joanne calls Penn's boyfriend Jonathan, and Jonathan was at work, and he was obviously very concerned, and he said, I will stop by. I have a meeting to go to, a 12-step meeting to go to after work. After that, I'm going to go by Penn's house and see what's up. He thought maybe she was ill or something like that. So later that evening, Jonathan is one of the first is there at the house. It smells like paint in the house because there had been some house painters that had come later in the day to do some work. The dog was still there. Fluff was still in the house, but Penn was not, which was very, very concerning to him because those two were inseparable. Penn would take Fluff with her to the farmer's market and to the grocery store and to AA meetings, and the dog would wait in the car, and if it was too cold, she wouldn't go. And so the idea that it's the middle of winter, there's a snowstorm coming, the dog is alone in the house, Penn isn't there, it dawns on Jonathan that that something terrible has happened. When he plays Penn's phone messages on her answering machine, there are several messages from Sandy, who saying, we need to talk about the bombshell that you dropped on me this morning. And so Jonathan calls Sandy. When he finds out what the message was about, what the original phone call was about, this whole thing about go back to Ken, move into the house, Jonathan immediately realizes, no, Penn would never say that. Sandy said, well, she did. Jonathan said, no, she would never say that. So you don't get it. He was here. Ken was here making her say that. And now she's gone and he took her.
So now what does he do? Now he's convinced that Ken Carpenter has everything to do with this. And so what's his next, what's his response? What does he do next?
Oh, well, he calls the state police, and living in this tiny corner of Sullivan County, it takes an hour for a trooper to get there, and he takes some information, and the trooper is very concerned, but he needs to immediately go off to another call, kind of leaving Jonathan alone in this big house of Penn's with the dog and his own thoughts, and so he starts calling around. And so he starts calling, looking for Ken. He calls Ken's house, leaves some messages, finally gets a hold of Harv. Harv tells Jonathan that, right now that she and Ken are going through some issues, and Ken is staying someplace else, and leave her alone, and slams the phone down on him.
That's in response to, though, that he's leaving messages right away. And he's been criticized a little bit later, and we'll talk about that. He's leaving messages right away that to insinuate or intimate or whatever you want to say that Ken Carpenter is involved somehow. So that's why, to explain how his wife, who's oblivious to everything, is sort of concerned. Why are you leaving these kinds of messages on my phone?
Yeah, he was very angry. And of course, he was very sure in his heart that he knew this, because he could. He says later he could see it coming. The animosity that Ken was building towards Penn. There was an incident about a month earlier where, after a meeting, Penn got home and realized that Ken had followed her all the way home. And when they got out of their cars, Ken just said, "I just need to talk to Sandy. Can you get a message to Sandy?" And Penn says, "Go away." Well, Jonathan realizes later that that was a dry run for Ken. It was his first attempt at killing Penn, but he couldn't do it at that moment. He had to come up with another plan. So he knows, Jonathan in his heart knows that it's Ken, although there's no evidence at the time of that. And the house is spotless. There's no blood. There's no sign of a struggle. Other than Penn, there's really nothing else missing. That's peculiar to the police. Of course, they know that Penn likes to, hike in the woods, they're not they can't rule out the fact that she, went out for a hike in the morning and tripped over a log and is, in need of medical assistance somewhere, or that she, decided to run off and join the circus. They also can't get a hold of her second husband, Richard Rankin. For some reason, they're calling him, and he's nowhere to be found. So they're very concerned about that. And Jonathan, of course, as the boyfriend, just sort of naturally would be a suspect in his lover's disappearance. So to everybody else, there's still a lot of investigation to do. But to Jonathan, he knows in his heart it's Ken Carpenter's responsible for Penn's disappearance.
He's pretty sure, but he's also pretty paranoid. You also put that in the book. He's pretty paranoid when he can't get a hold of the former husband. Said it had only been 6 months or so since they had been divorced. So this is a person that's pretty sure it's Carpenter, but he's also pretty paranoid as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can imagine. Suspicious. Yeah, you can imagine, what he was going through at the time, where the love of his life is missing. He feels helpless. Also feels scared. I mean, even though he really thinks that that it's Jonathan. That Jonathan thinks that it's Ken. He has no guarantee that if Ken's a killer, that Ken isn't going to come after him too. So there's so he spends several days going from couch to couch and hiding in different homes because he just doesn't know what Ken is up to.
And he also enlists his friend that had originally come to the house with him. The guy stayed in the vehicle, but an old friend, and he gets that friend to come over and stay at Penn's house with him. And these guys they say, geez, I don't have a gun. And so they sleep on the floor. So it really, you've taken the reader into the story where, it becomes real serious. He doesn't know what Ken Carpenter is capable of. So.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that sort of, foreshadows the way the rest of the investigation plays out. It's a little dark, and Ken Carpenter, obviously has this sort of preternatural influence over everything that ends up happening.
Now, the police initially, when Jonathan actually gets to speak to Ken Carpenter and accuses of him being involved, and Ken hangs up on him and says, listen, I already spoke to the police, you have in a book, it's a mystery whether that's even true, and we find out a little bit later on, or by this time, that the police had contacted him, but only by telephone, and asked him about Penn, and he denied any wrongdoing, obviously. Tell us about the first time that police actually speak with Ken Carpenter, and what does he have to say?
Well, two New Hampshire state police officers visited Ken Carpenter's home the following day, and the day after Sandy is last heard from. There had been a good couple of inches of snow around, and Ken was outside with his snowblower, and clearing a path in his front yard. And the troopers pull up, and absolutely no reaction from Ken, which is odd because I think most people when they see a police car stop at their home, are at least going to wonder what the situation is. So these two uniformed troopers talk to Ken. Ken is at first, very angry that Jonathan has implicated him in Penn's disappearance, and complains bitterly to the troopers about that. But once he gets that out of his system, he is, calm and appears to be helpful with the troopers, telling them a little bit about, what does he know about Penn. He says he hasn't really seen Penn. They know each other through AA, and other than that, couldn't say. And while they're there, they notice that there's a smell of smoke, that he's been burning brush, and they also notice a metal barrel, a small 30-gallon metal barrel that had been on the back of a pickup truck, sort of dragged through the snow and dumped off to the side. He's obviously doing some work. Ken lets him look around the property, look at the cars. He seems to have, really just sort of gone along and been cooperative. But one of the things that he tells them, because they want to know, well, where were you yesterday about the time Penn was last seen? He said, I had gone up and I'd gone snowshoeing, and I went snowshoeing, at the local golf course, because it's a big open area, and I'd like to snowshoe there. So after that, the troopers drove over to the golf course, and fresh blanket of snow, and no snowshoe tracks anywhere. So they know that Ken has a problem with his alibi, and so now they are honed in on him.
Now, has there been any other suspects whatsoever, or any other people that they question? And obviously, they have the father of the three children, and he comes in contact with the state police initially and is very cooperative. And of course, he has a good alibi. Is there any other focus at all for the state police other than Ken Carpenter?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that they do, Penn was a community advocate. She was always taking up causes. They looked into the possibility. Well, she opposed, the expansion of the local ski resort. Could possibly somebody involved in that project want to eliminate Penn? And there doesn't seem to be a lot of juice behind that kind of thought. The only other person that sort of seemed to fit the bill, the only other person that would seem to have an axe to grind against Penn is Penn's second husband, her recently divorced husband, Richard Rankin. And police are very concerned because, like I said, he's not home, so they don't know where Penn is and they don't know where Richard is. And they're concerned that he's got her someplace or that he's killed her and is on the lam. It isn't until a couple of days later that Richard contacts the police. He had been in Florida. He had gone there for the winter, and he had just heard the news that Penn was missing. He was able to show with his credit card receipts and whatnot that he'd been in Florida all along. So with that guy crossed off the suspect list, the only person left was Kenneth Carpenter.
Now, I'm a bit confused. When did police find a bone fragment in the fire pit?
Well, that happened about a week after Penn disappeared. Investigators were very interested in Ken Carpenter. They wanted to talk to him some more. They asked him to come to the police station for an interview that they tape recorded. And again, Ken, denied any involvement. They questioned him a little further about his alibi, about the snowshoes and the golf course, and he said, I'm mistaken. I was actually at the high school and not at the golf course. He couldn't remember earlier a lot of what he had done that day, but then he remembered that he had gotten in his car and driven into the next state of Massachusetts and spent some time and then drove back. And he had sort of a very kind of thin telling of his day, the day that that Penn disappeared. So the detective, Sean Scahan, conducted this interview and continued to listen to the tape of the interview to try to, find holes in it. And then the next day, there was an anonymous telephone call placed to the police department, and Detective Scahan happened to be there and picked up the phone, and he immediately recognized this voice as Ken Carpenter because he had been listening to the voice for, hours. And the anonymous caller said that you don't have to worry about Penn. She's fine. I dropped her off at the airport. And, implying that that's why she's missing. She's gone out of town. The caller wouldn't say who he was, but he did say Penn left something at the payphone at the general store and then hung up. So police were very puzzled with this. The general store was right next to the police station. They ran down, and sure enough, underneath the payphone vestibule was a plastic bag which was taped underneath the payphone with orange duct tape. When they took the tape off, they took the bag out, they found inside a little envelope, and inside the envelope was a key. The key was to a safe deposit box to a local bank. So the investigators went to the bank, used the key on Penn's safe deposit box, and found her passport inside. So they knew Penn did not go to run off to the islands. Her passport was there. And of course, they're extremely curious as, why would why would somebody, leave this key around? In the meantime, they're tapping the phone not tapping, but they have permission from Sandy to record telephone calls between her and Ken. And Ken keeps saying stuff like, I spoke to God, and we're going to find out in 3 days why, Penn disappeared. And they can tell in the telephone calls that Ken is using Penn's disappearance as a way to get back with Sandy. Trying to convince Sandy that they should get together and go look for Penn. All of this stuff sort of leads the cops to believe that Ken is somewhat behind the problem here, the Penn's disappearance. So they get a warrant and they go out to Ken's home in the woods. He lives in a little cabin deep in the woods. It's a February evening, and there's an old-fashioned nor'easter coming through. It's a blizzard. They can't get down the road to the cabin. They need a snowplow to come out, especially for them. The state troopers pull up at the cabin, and it's empty. They go around looking for Penn. They crawl in a back window. They don't find any sign of Penn, get any sign of a struggle, any sign of blood. But outside is that fire pit that was there the first time they visited. And the fire is still kind of smoldering. And when investigators looked into the embers of the fire pit, they were able to find something that looked like a piece of bone. And so they realized then that they had found where Penn Meyer wound up.
Now, in all of this, it was interesting is that when he was having this torrid affair with Sandra Merritt, his wife thought he was at home, so Ken would go over to her apartment on her brother's property, and they would watch CSI. Their favorite program was CSI, so Monday and Thursday they would watch CSI, Crime Scene Investigation. And I wanted to ask, once this police had Ken Carpenter in their sights, they must have looked to his wife for whatever information she might have about her husband, possible alibi, or anything else about as a character that might help them in the prosecution. In that regard, what did she have to say, this suddenly very, very surprised and angered woman, no doubt? What did she have to say, and was she in any aid whatsoever to police?
That's a very good question, because Harv ran hot and cold with the investigators. Remember that despite everything that he was accused of, Ken still had a knack for controlling people, his wife included. When she discovered the affair that Ken had with Sandy, she was crushed, but she started to rationalize that this wasn't Ken's fault, this was Sandy's fault. And so she was going to commit herself to God and to get Ken back. So she stayed by Ken's side through the restraining order process, and then even after he's arrested for Penn's homicide, she sticks with him. And she visits him, and she makes a lot of telephone calls to him in the jail, telephone calls that are recorded. Ken is trying to tell, Harv to, don't say something stupid. Don't ask me a dumb question because it's being recorded. And Harv, wanted to believe Ken that he was innocent. Harv was a nursing student, and so when she was in class, they would talk about bones, and that she realized that they only found a small amount of bones in that fire pit, and that Penn, even though she was a small person, that the bone should have been falling out of that fire pit. They should have been overflowing. So she kept asking Ken, what was what, and so Ken eventually told her. This is several months later. Spring is, winter's gone, spring is there. Said to go out into, the tree line of the property, and she went, found this hollow stump, and found some matter, some debris that was inside it. It was more bones and Penn's distinctive jewelry. So Harv thought about it, and she did call the police, and she was helpful to the police. And there were the times when she wouldn't be, where she was, kind of resentful of the police and didn't want to cooperate and would still do things that Ken asked her to do, like she found some notebooks with some of his writing in it, so she burned that so the police wouldn't get it. But then another time she found some letters that were hidden away in the attic, and she turned those over to the police. And on these recorded telephone calls, Penn, who's sort of struggling with what the truth is, really acts as the best cross-examiner of Ken Carpenter, because she's angry. She wants to know what's going on. One of the things that Ken uses to keep control over Harv is to try to convince her that he's innocent and that the reason he's being so secretive is because he's protecting her. There is a third person. The real killer is a guy by the name of Phil. And this Phil is someone that Ken had never seen before, but Phil said, I know your problem, and I know how to take care of it, and that when that Ken left Penn alone with Phil, and when Ken came back, Penn was gone, and Phil said, keep that fire going. Harv believed this. She wanted to believe this. Every time she met somebody named Phil, she freaked out thinking, this might be that Phil. But after a while, she started to question whether or not Phil existed, and Ken's description of Phil kept changing. First he was the same height and clean shaven, and then he had a beard, and then he was bald, and then he wasn't. And Harv was the one who was the hardest on him, really trying to get him to tell her the truth. At one point she says, if this is your alibi, you gotta keep it straight. So Harv, like I said, Harv ran hot and cold, but ultimately she was helpful to the investigation, if for no other reason. She acted like any other wife would, and not take any baloney from her husband, and would get to the bottom of it.
So, not to give too much away, we alluded to these very, very crucial notebooks. Notes on a Killing, which is the title of the book. This would be largely a circumstantial case. Don't give us too much. I'm going to leave the audience hanging for a change. But what was the crucial evidence that the prosecution felt, or what was the theory that the prosecution put forward on why this crime occurred, and what was their crucial evidence?
Well, their theory was, of course, that Ken Carpenter viewed Penn Meyer as an obstacle to his relationship with Sandy, and that Penn had to be eliminated in order for the affair to resume. And one of the things that Ken did was, as a fan of CSI and the other police procedurals. He thought he knew how cops did things, and he knew about evidence, and that he could do, what he needed to do to get away with the murder. And he was trying to get, his goal was to get Penn to convince Sandy to get back together with him. And so in order to do that, he needed to put words in her mouth. And for weeks before Penn's disappearance, Ken basically planned it out, rough drafts and scripts for what Penn should say, and which is why that phone call, the language, the content was so distinctive. It was completely unlike Penn, but everything like Ken Carpenter. And investigators, when they were combing Ken Carpenter's house, there was a red leather chair, and they happened to take the cushion off, and they found a little blue notebook. And as they went through all the different pages, they saw Ken Carpenter had spent weeks planning the death of Penn Meyer, and it was complete with, with a script for her to follow that she probably followed with a gun to her head.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting case and twists. And we won't talk about the trial at all because it's you would think it would be a slam dunk, but of course it's not. And so we'll leave our audience at that. Very, very, very fascinating tale. Other than Notes on a Killing, I wanted to ask what other books have you authored or co-authored in the true crime genre?
Well, Notes on a Killing is my fourth book. My first was Wicked Intentions, which came out in 2008. It's about a female serial killer by the name of Sheila LaBar, who lived on a horse farm in rural New Hampshire, would lure men to her farm and use them for sex, and then when she was done, she would dismember the bodies and burn them in a fire pit. So you're starting to see there's a theme here with some of these books. I seem to be coming back around again. The other two books were written by myself and Rebecca Lavoie. One of those was called Our Little Secret, which is about a man named Danny Paquette who was working in his backyard and was killed by a stray bullet on the first day of hunting season. And some of the cops thought it was a hunting accident. But 20 years later, they arrested a guy who had been, at the time of the shooting, 17 years old and who had never met never met Danny Paquette. And everybody in town knew that this guy had pulled the trigger, and he had done it because Danny Paquette was a child molester. And so for 25 years, people in the town knew who did it, but kept the secret because they thought he had it coming. The other book we've written is called Legally Dead. It's about an attorney who goes through a very rough divorce. He tries to drive his ex-wife crazy so that he can get the kids and stop having to pay her any money. He tries to drive her to commit suicide. He terrorizes her. He hires thugs to harass her, to slash her tires. When none of that works, he puts a pipe bomb in her mailbox to try to scare her. And then eventually, one day, she just disappears. And investigators don't know where she's gone, but there's a conspiracy around how she disappeared and a real rogues gallery of people who were involved. So all of the books take place in New England, and they all have a rich cast of characters.
Yes, certainly. And if people are compelled to do so, do you have a website that they might go to, or obviously you're on Facebook, but tell us how fans can contact you.
If they are so compelled, Dan, they could reach out to us at the website is authorkevinflynn.com. We're on Facebook and Twitter. We try to stay pretty active, talking about the latest stuff going on in crime around the country.
And you're on Facebook as well? Facebook friends?
Yeah, we're Facebook. Again, it's Kevin Flynn.
Oh, yeah, you just mentioned. Sorry. There we go.
And and we're tweeting and and Instagramming and whatever else we got to do these days. iTunes, I don't know, whatever it takes to get to the true crime fans, because they are great. They're very loyal. They love they love the stories, and we hope we give them something to enjoy.
Before we go to, I just wanted to ask, what's your partnership like with Rebecca Lavoie? What's her role? I mean, obviously you don't do exactly the same thing. Just tell us a little bit about Rebecca Lavoie and her role in these books.
Well, I guess for disclosure, I should say Rebecca and I are now married, so I guess I'd say that she's the boss. But
she's the boss. Good answer.
But the way two people write is, I'd say, well, it's like your husband and wife moving a couch. They sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. Look, basically, I will write the first draft. I'll sort of map out the arc of the story and put in the facts, kind of put the bones down, and Rebecca comes by, puts all the muscle on it, brushes up on the prose.
Nice.
So that's the way we work. Sometimes it's like, that person, that character, you should do those interviews, you should write about her, because, for some reason, but mostly that's the way the assignments get doled out.
Oh, that's great. Sounds like a great partnership. So obviously is a great partnership. So I want to thank you very much.
Look, she's listening. I'm going to tell her it's a great partnership, yes.
Well, I say so, too. So there you go. I want to thank you very much, Kevin, for a great interview. People have been listening to Kevin Flynn, Notes on a Killing. I want to thank you very much, Kevin, and hope to speak to you again about another one of your fine books. So have a great evening.
Dan, absolutely. You can have us on any time. We love your podcast.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You have a great evening, and thanks once again. Good night.
Sure.